topic we're going to consider is the one of common property. Again, a situation where there can be a market failure. So the last couple of classes we've been looking at market failures from the perspective of externalities. However, externalities can also arise with resources to which everyone has free access. So what we would consider common or open property. So unlike private property, you cannot be excluded from using common property. So because people don't have to pay to use these, they are overused. So you can have common pools, the internet, roads, fisheries, etc., all of which have common or open ownership. So they tend to be overused or abused, simply because nobody has the property right to protect them. So if it's open for everybody to use, everybody will use it as much as they want without consequence for anybody else. And perhaps in some instances people might use it more quickly in case somebody else uses it. So for example, in fisheries, there tends to be a race to get fish out of the water. They're a common resource, a common pool, available to everybody. But in order to preserve fish stocks, you should leave fish in the water. But if one fisherman does it, it's going to have no impact, because the next person to come across that shoal of fish will simply take them out. We don't have this problem in areas, say, such as cattle, another product where there is huge demand, but because property rights can be assigned, the stocks can be maintained. You're not going to get a farmer go out and kill everything in one given year or one given time. They'd stagger it out over a period of time. So what these products tend to suffer from is what's called the tragedy of the commons. So global fisheries are in a state of crisis because overfishing has raised doubts about the sustainability of fish stocks. And many species now, the level of fishing that takes place is quite low, from some popular species such as, say, North Atlantic cod, which used to be a staple and would form the part of, say, everything from fish fingers to fish suppers. But now the prevalence of cod is much reduced. Go to the frozen food aisle in any supermarket and say, I want to buy a cod fish finger. You're unlikely to be able to find one. It will be a white fish, but it'll be a different fish, simply because the stocks have been diminished to such a huge extent. Part of the problem is government actions. Governments see their fisheries as being strategic. So governments subsidise their fishing fleets to provide employment. So particularly in coastal areas, the fishing industry is a large source of employment. So just like agriculture is subsidised in many countries, particularly in the EU, countries also subsidise their shipping industry or their fishing industry. So globally, about 90 billion is spent to catch 70 billion worth of fish in dollar terms. So the subsidy is 20 billion. And that's basically just to keep employment levels up. That in the aggregate sense, the industry is making a substantial loss, but that loss is being offset, and in fact more than offset, to allow these people to earn an income by subsidies. People keeping their industries afloat. So in Europe, countries such as Spain would be large subsidisers of their fishing industry. Huge fishing fleet, providing employment on a huge scale, but on a loss-making basis. But that loss is covered through the subsidies. So you'd find much the same in agriculture. If we're to look at the subsidies that come in, Irish agriculture has an income of about 6 billion a year. 2 billion of that comes from EU subsidies. So I'm not quite sure the exact measure of output in the industry, but I guess it's something less than 6 billion. That a lot of the income comes from subsidies. So when I complain about fishing, it is prevalent in other areas. However, the main reason for overfishing, the reduction in fish stocks, is an externality. No one owns the fish before they are caught. So once a fish is in the water, you can't assign a property right. You can't say that a particular fishing fleet, a particular country, or a particular individual owns a particular fish. Fish are free to swim wherever they wish. There are no boundaries, no fences. So you might have fishing waters in which particular nations can fish. The fish don't obey those boundaries. They will simply go from region to region. And migration can be an important area. So with ill-defined property rights, the market works badly. So the externality is that others bear the cost of one's own overfishing. So if a particular vessel goes out and overfishes in a particular season or over a sequence of seasons, they get the benefit. They've caught the fish, landed the fish, and can sell them. They capture the revenue that generates. But everybody else then suffers the consequences. Everybody else then goes out and there's no fish to catch. So there is an externality. One person's activity is harming somebody else. So can it be prevented? Well, if the ocean were controlled by one owner, well, then the global fishing problem would be solved. Because it wouldn't be a race to catch as much fish as that person can this year. With a single owner, they'd stretch out the benefits and look for a sustainable flow of income. They'd know that any fish they leave in the sea this year, they can come back and catch next year. Whereas for an individual fisherman, now it's a case of any fish I leave in the sea this year, somebody else will catch tomorrow. But with a single owner, it would happen. However, a single owner for the huge fishing area that the planet contains, more than 70% of the surface area is water, is unlikely to happen. Informal conservation methods may work, but only in tight-knit fishing communities. So there are areas where people have grouped together and said, look, we shouldn't be taking a huge amount of stock out of the water. It particularly happens in stocks that don't move very much. So fishing for the likes of lobster, etc., in coves, in particular harbours, in close-knit communities, they can set overall targets for themselves, knowing that if they take too much out this year, there'll be nothing left next year. But that tends to only work in small, close-knit communities where the stock isn't very mobile, where the community itself will benefit from maintaining the stocks at a particular level. So there are examples of tight-knit communities holding their fishing stocks together through cooperation, by the realization that it shouldn't be a race, that it should be more about staggering how much is taken out. When it comes to a government approach, government impose a huge range of regulations on fishing. There's limits on the number and size of boats. So the size of the fleet and the size of the boats. There's limit when fishing can occur. So particular seasons in which the fishing can take place. So these input controls lead to predictable distortions. If you restrict the number of boats, the boats that are there just get bigger. If you restrict the length of boats, the boats just get wider. And if you restrict the size of crews, you just have more high-tech equipment. So every regulation just generates what you'd expect to be the predicted response. If the race is to get as much fish out of the water as possible, if a restriction is put in place, people will just work around it. Bigger boats, wider boats, more technology. Governments then looked to output-based methods. So controlling the inputs wasn't really going to be effective. Limiting the number of boats, the size of the boats, the season wasn't effective. So let's control the output. Let's look at directly controlling the output. And that has led to the existence of a quota system. So regulators can assign a quota to each fishing vessel, or in the case of the EU, each country, defining how much it can catch. Again, there is something similar in agriculture, with a quota system limiting production. The differences, or the existence of the quotas, are somewhat different. In the fishing industry, it's the case of trying to maintain stocks. In the agriculture sector, it's trying to maintain prices. But there is now a move away from quotas in agriculture. I think by 2015, for milk production, quotas will be all but eliminated. So the agriculture sector will be free to produce as much as they wish and respond to price changes. In the fishing sector, it's about quantity rather than controlling the price. So quota directly address the basic issue by establishing or trying to establish property rights and eliminating the race to fish. If you have a particular quota to catch a certain quantity or weight of fish, there's no point going out and doing it in the first month. You're done, then your income is earned, you're only idle then for the rest of the time. If you have a quota, you can stretch it out and have a more sustainable fishing pattern. Well, this is the theory. It's hard to know whether it works. However, unlike with input regulation, the fishers have a reason to invest in improving productivity. So the input changes are about making the industry more effective, Not in the case here where it's about going around particular regulations. So it's about using the money effectively rather than using the money to avoid particular regulations. In theory, this is a workable solution. The quota system has a certain number of benefits going for it, but it's imperfect, as monitoring the property rights is expensive. How do you monitor the actual quantities caught? How do you monitor the locations where they're caught? And how do you monitor all other of the sort of behaviours that go with quotas? So, for example, if you set a quote on a particular stock and that is relatively valuable, you might have fishing vessels going out trying to capture that stock. But on each occasion, they might catch something else, a cheaper, less valuable, less profitable fish. What simply may happen is that before landing the fish, they may separate the catch into that which they want to declare and that which they want to discard. You might get lots of fish that's caught, fish end up dying and just jump back into the water. So the quotas can lead to undesirable and inefficient outcomes if not monitored correctly. Also, the regulator must devise rules on who initially receives the quotas. So this is a big thing from an Irish perspective, and from time to time you'll see Simon Coveney pop up in the news about a quota negotiation. He's gone to the Council of Ministers or Fishery Ministers in EU, reaching quota agreements, and then ongoing monitoring is needed to check that catches do not exceed the quotas. But unless you can do this on the vessel, you're not necessarily going to be able to check what a vessel catches. If you just look at what they bring to shore, you may not be getting a fuller picture. So there is and has been some on-sea monitoring. So it's virtually impossible, though, to perfectly enforce property rights in fish. Ireland's marine area, not quite sure the exact multiple, but perhaps is up to 10 or maybe even more times our land area. So our marine boundary extends far longer than our land boundary. Yet to cover that, we have a tiny navy, maybe 3 or 4 major vessels and a couple of more smaller vessels to cover a huge area. It simply is an impossible task for the size of monitoring and enforcement we can undertake. So you'll get frequent claims of fishing vessels from other jurisdictions entering Irish fishing water, catching fish and leaving again. But unless you can actually go and catch them and see them at it, very little can be taken. They'll just claim that they were driving through it, didn't catch any fish at all, we're just going from A to B, just happened to pass through your water. So the enforcement of such a huge area is quite difficult. So when looking at commons problems, there are 2 general approaches that the government can take. One is direct regulation through taxation or restriction of access. So in the fishing industry, it tends to be direct regulation through quotas. If the government can also set a tax or a fee, they can internalise the externality, while a quota limits consumption. So for the internet, tends to abuse, maybe charging a price per email would limit the amount of spam. But then you get the trade-off. You're charging people for emails that have a social benefit, and then you're trying to prevent emails that don't. If the tax is too high, the benefits of doing so will be lower than the cost. Or the government can clearly define and assign property rights. When property rights are in play, you don't tend to have overuse problems. Here's just an image that highlights some of the problems between public and private ownership. So this is an image from farmland in Zimbabwe. I'm not quite sure which year the image was taken, but it is under the stewardship of Robert Mugabe. So there have been serious tensions in Zimbabwe about ownership of land, particularly ownership by white settlers going back to the time of the colonization. So a lot of land has been, in a sense, apprehended, and much of it has been made communal or public land. Everybody can use. But you can see the difference in the quality and the availability of water between private farmland, where property rights are defined, where if somebody overuses, abuses a particular piece of land, they suffer the consequences. They get short-term benefits, but they also suffer the long-term costs. Whereas with communal farmland, if it's open for everybody to use, if I decide, look, there's a fine piece of land, I won't overuse it, I'll come back next year and use it again. If somebody leaves it aside, because it's communal, somebody else will just use it. So you can get a huge distinction on the left-hand side between land that's open for everybody to use, virtually no water available, very little grass, and this land here is obviously of very little use. The productive capacity over here is hugely reduced, even though it's in public ownership. And over on the right then you have private farmland. Much greater visibility of water. Water conservation, much more prevalent over here, simply because if somebody knows that they save water, it'll be there for them when they come back. Much greater conservation of the land and far greener. Property rights exist here, they don't exist here. And that, as an image, clearly shows the impact of common property, where one goes being overused and one tends to be used in a more efficient manner. Of course, from a social perspective, there are clearly issues of who's getting the benefit of this. What is the distribution? From an economic perspective, this has better productive capacity. From a fairness perspective, the equality may not be ideal. So again, you get a trade-off between efficiency and equity. If you want the most equal system, give the land to everyone. End up with this. It's hugely fair, but everybody's boiling stones for soup. If you want the most efficient system, where the land is most productive, assign property rights. But then whoever gets those property rights is being allowed to capture the benefits. So clearly in former colonized countries such as Zimbabwe, there are difficulties in sort of moving from a situation where there sort of is historical reasons for land ownership rather than social. So it does appear as if Mugabe has no idea about economics, if he's willing to go down this approach. And his macroeconomic policy would show similar. His tendency to print money to solve his problems would suggest that he hasn't a clue. But Mugabe is actually hugely educated in economics. Mugabe has 3 bachelor's degrees in economics, history and literature, and he was in prison for 11 years and completed 4 degrees by correspondence with the University of London, and he got a master's degree in economics, a bachelor's degree in administration, as well as 2 law degrees. This man is probably the best educated leader in the world, close to running the most dysfunctional country in the world. So with 2 economics degrees, including a master's, we think he'd have a better grasp of basic economic concepts. Doesn't seem he has. Or maybe we can question the quality of the degrees he got. The final issue we look at is the concept of public goods. So a competitive market may produce too little of a good in the presence of a positive externality. So up to now we've been focusing on negative externalities. Negative externalities in consumption, such as passive smoking, driving, etc. Negative externalities in production, such as occurs with common goods. With public goods, we actually have a positive externality. The provision of a public good conveys benefits on everybody. So if I provide the public good, everybody gains. The problem is that if I can't capture all the benefits, I may not be too inclined to provide the good. So this may occur when producers cannot restrict access to the good. So a public good is a good whose consumption by one person, by rather than be, by one person, does not preclude others from using it. So private goods are properties of rivalry and exclusion. Rivalry simply means one person using the good prevents somebody else from using it. So consumers are rivals for an apple, shall we say. If one person consumes the apple, nobody else can. And private goods have excludability. There are property rights that prevent you from using the good unless you have the owner's acceptance. So with an apple, you have to go into the shop and pay for it. If you don't, you're simply stealing. There is a system in place to protect property rights. But with public goods, there is no rivalry, and exclusion is very difficult. Can't stop somebody from using it. So I could walk in here and declare that I own the lights. And every time you come to a lecture, you have to give me €2 to use the lights. And if you don't give me the €2, you can't use the lights. Clearly, as somebody trying to get money out of people, I face a number of difficulties. One, I can't stop people from using the lights. If I provide the lights for one person, if there's one nice person in the room who's willing to give me €2 for the lights, I turn them on. The other 60 or 70 people can benefit. I can't exclude and shine the light down on one person to the exclusion of others. And people aren't rivals. Once the light is provided, we could have 10 people inside here. We could have 100 people inside here. We could have maximum capacity inside here. It wouldn't deflect from any person's ability to use the light. It doesn't get used up the more people that are under it. So it doesn't suffer from rivalry and excludability. If that was the case then and I came in looking for €2 at the start of every class, I'd just be laughed out the door. Whereas if I sat down here and I had sheets of paper with answers to the exam on it, and I said I want €2 for that, it's likely I'd do much better. So the whole concept of being able to capture the benefits has an impact on the willingness to provide goods. So you might get a market for exam papers, you're not going to get a market for light. So rivalry and exclusion we've defined. So all public goods lack rivalry, but only some lack exclusion. So there's no need to ration a public good. Everyone can consume it. Indeed, excluding someone from consuming it harms that person without helping other consumers. So if I said to one person, you have to sit in the dark, there's no real gain for everybody else. If I had an apple for everybody in the audience, and I took one off one person, at least then I could give 2 to somebody else. The loss to one could be a gain for somebody else. But if I said to one person, I'm putting a sheet on top of you, you must sit in the dark, nobody else gains. Everybody can use the same unit of the good without a cost to somebody else. So problems arise when no one can be prevented from consuming a public good. If nobody can be prevented from consuming it, how does somebody charge for it? If, as soon as it's provided, everybody can use it, there's no incentive for people to pay. So if you don't have an incentive for people to pay, the market will not provide it. So how do we have a market for public goods? How do we get a market for light? Is there a market for street lights? Or we can extend it onto a market, say, for television signals. Much the same as a light. If one person tunes into a TV signal, they can use it. 10, 100, 1,000, 100,000, 1 million people can tune into the same TV signal. The good is not rivalrous. Once it's provided once, any number of people can use it. So markets for public goods only exist if non-purchasers can be excluded from consuming them. So thus markets do not exist for non-exclusive public goods. And if the government does not provide them, no one provides them. So with television signals, you get a difference between, say, public broadcasters like RTE, which make their signal publicly available, and private broadcasters, say, like Sky. Both RTE and Sky's signal is non-rivalrous. Any number of people can use it. But they differ hugely in their excludability. If you want to tune into RTE, a television and a wire coat hanger will get it for you. And off you go and watch it. If you want to tune in and watch Sky, well, you need to get a box, and then you need to get a decoder card. You need to pay them 20 or 25 euro a month, whatever it is, to be able to watch it through legal means. So the product they've created is excludable. And that differs then in how they can charge for it. RTE want to charge 160 euro a year. Without legislation and the Licence Fee Broadcasting Act, they wouldn't be able to raise that money. If they said, send us on the 160 euro at your own time, they'd collect very little of it. So it requires legislation. Whereas with B Sky B, if somebody wants it, they're much more willing to pay up. So in Ireland, there are about 1 million cable customers, cable households. So about 60% of all households are willing to pay for satellite television, or whatever you want to refer to. I assume virtually 100% of households use RTE, but I'm not quite sure what the level of compliance is with the 160 euro. I think it's 160 euro. You probably don't know. I should know. The demand for public goods is different from that for a private good. So the market for a private good, the demand is horizontal. We add up the quantities. If there are more people wanting to use apples, we need more apples. So the quantity in our supply and demand graphs tends to be along the horizontal axis. So if quantity is going to increase, the units must increase. However, with public goods, if we have one broadcast signal, that's enough for 1, 10, 100 million people. We don't need to increase the quantity. We don't need a Fair City studio in everybody's house. We just need one in Dublin and then bash out the signal and everybody can use it. So a public good lacks rivalry. Thus many people can get pleasure or utility from the same unit of output. So we don't need to increase along the horizontal axis. Whatever quantity is being produced can be used over and over again. So as a consequence, the social demand curve for a public good is the vertical sum of the individual demand curves. So with most goods we tend to add horizontally. If 2 people want 5 apples each, the market demand then is 10. But when it comes to public goods, if 2 people want to tune into a TV signal, we still only need 1 TV signal. What we add up is the benefit they get. So we sum vertically. So if we take 2 individuals, person 1, here's the price of the good, here's the quantity, and person 2. For the market demand, however many units are being provided, they can use it, the same unit, over and over again. We don't need to increase the quantity. So at 0, the price they're willing to pay is A, and the maximum quantity they would use where they get positive benefit is out to B. For the market demand curve, we just add up willingness to pay. So if person 1 is willing to pay A for the first unit, and person 2 is willing to pay A for the first unit, the market is willing to pay 2A for the first unit. So with apples, you'd add up across units. What is person A willing to pay for the first apple? 20 cents. You sell it at that. What is person B willing to sell for the first apple? 20 cents. But you need to have 2 apples to satisfy the demand. When it comes to a public good, the first unit satisfies the demand of both people. So the maximum quantity that they'd purchase will be out here at B. They can both use it, 10 people can use it, 100 people can use it. So a public good provides a service without rivalry. So, as we say, demand curves reflect marginal benefit. How much am I willing to pay for the next unit? But as a public good benefits all consumers at once, the marginal benefit to society of an additional unit is the sum of the benefit to each individual. So with 2 consumers, in a highly stylized example, the social or market marginal benefit curve is just the sum of the benefit to the first person and the sum of the benefit to the second person. So thus the market demand curve or social demand curve is the vertical sum of the individual demand curves. So why might this lead to a market inefficiency? Why might this lead to a market failure? if you have a setting where you have a public good. So we'll consider the example of a public good with a constant marginal cost. So an example, sort of firm up on this, could be, say, security in a shopping centre. Security guards in a shopping centre. So you might have 30, 40, 50 shops in a shopping centre looking to provide security. We'll assume initially that it's done on an individual basis. If a shop is going to have security, they pay for it. So we'll assume there's fixed marginal cost of having 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever it is. Could be the cost per hour, cost per day of a security guard. So here we have two separate demand curves. So we have D1, which we'll assume is the demand curve for a shop. Give me a telephone shop, a mobile phone shop, and D2, the demand curve for a clothes retailer. So both in the same unit, both in the same shopping centre, they'll get different benefits from having a security guard. So we'll assume a clothes retailer is perhaps more liable, more susceptible to theft than a mobile phone provider. So these are their individual demand curves. How much does it cost to provide security guards? So here is the constant marginal cost. You can assume it's cost per hour, cost per day, whatever it might be, of having a security guard. So what will happen in the competitive situation? So to find the equilibrium, just look for the position where the supply and demand curve cross. So the marginal cost curve gives us the supply. How much do security guards need to be paid? The demand curve gives us the marginal benefit. So we can see for the first retailer, the mobile phone shop, the benefit they get is never matched by the cost. So if operating individually, a mobile phone retailer would not get security. There is benefits, maybe through safety, reduction in damage, reduction in vandalism, maybe some theft. But the benefits of the security guard simply aren't worth it for the cost incurred. So for retailer 1, they would buy no security guards. If we look at retailer 2, the benefits for them actually exceed the costs all the way up to here. So you get EP, the private, or competitive equilibrium. So they'll go for quantity Q1. So a competitive market supplies as many units as demanded when price equals marginal cost, and that's here. So at that price, person 1 would not buy any units, and person 2 would buy Q1. So if the individuals act independently, the private equilibrium is outcome EP, and Q1 benefits are bought. However, you look at the market outcome. The presence of the security card in the clothes retailer is likely to have benefits for the mobile phone retailer. Standing outside the door, patrolling, walking around, even if it's in a neighbouring shop, is likely to act as a deterrent. The ability for a thief, if detected, to get away is reduced by the presence of the security guard. So if you look at the market benefit, the market benefit of having Q1 security is actually up here. The clothes retailer benefits by this much, and the mobile phone retailer benefits by this much. So if we sum vertically, we end up here, where the benefit exceeds the cost. So the sum of the marginal benefits from Q1 units is greater than the marginal cost of the additional unit. And in fact, both stores would be better off if more security was provided. So here the benefit of extra security exceeds the costs until you get to ES. So this is the gain for the clothes retailer, and if you add the gain from the mobile phone retailer, you end up with the market demand curve up here. They could actually be collectively better off if they went to ES. The benefit will continually exceed the cost until you get out to quantity Q2. So if Q2 units are bought, The marginal social benefit equals the marginal cost. So thus, at the social equilibrium, EC42 units are bought. However, acting alone, person 2 buys fewer units than are socially optimal. So person 2 who gets a net benefit from the security will only go as far as Q1. They're not going to say, oh, I could buy more security and the mobile phone shop is going to benefit. That's not the way they're going to operate. They're going to look privately at their own costs and benefits and say, where does it stop becoming worthwhile for us to hire additional security? And that happens here. So we end up at Q1. So even though these benefits here would accrue from extra security and these benefits here, all person 2 considers is the benefit to them. And they just say, look, it's not worth it. There's no point having a security guard or 2 security guards or 3 security guards at particular times because the benefits they confer on us just aren't worth it for the costs. So the person acting alone buys lower because they ignore the positive externality provided to person 1. So they gain to the other retailer by having the security at presence. So thus a competitive market provides too little of the public good. So how in a sense can we solve it? So many people are unwilling to pay for their share of a public good. So what we get is the terminology saying that people can free ride, benefit from the actions of others. So simply sort of jump on board and get the benefits that somebody else is paying for. So governments and other collective actions can reduce free riding. So the methods include social pressure, mergers, compulsion, privatization. In the example we've used of security in a shopping centre, what generally happens is that security forms part of the tenancy agreement. That you pay rent to the shopping centre, but in order for the optimum amount of security to be provided, it forms part of the overall agreement. Everybody pays, everybody contributes. So it's not a case of each store doing it individually and you end up with under provision. If it's done collectively, what's basically a merger, you get a common system throughout the entire shopping centre. So this is generally why you don't see store security guards in large shopping centres, but you will see collective ones. They'll walk around, do laps of particular routes, and generally be relatively visible, but they'll all tend to be from the same company. And even in city centre areas, you can see it happening. If you look at particular streets, particular areas, it's likely you'll see security guards in the same uniform. That's not really a coincidence. That's more likely a collective bargaining agreement that's set up. It may be that certain shops have a better benefit, so they might contribute more, but everybody is contributing. And if you see an incident occurring, it's likely security guards will converge from a number of shops. Is it out of goodwill that they're doing it? They see one of their buddies chasing somebody, let's go on and see, can we catch him? Give him a toe where it might hurt. It's likely that they're actually working together. And this is essentially trying to reduce the problem of free riding and also ensure that the optimum amount is provided. Value in public goods, we won't go into.